The hush that followed Shaq's departure from Chase Langford's office wasn't silent at all. It was a quiet loudness, the kind that settled in people's shoulders and made them avoid eye contact. Reggie stood by the entrance to the lobby, still holding the now useless folder like it mattered. He knew when someone was being watched, and right now he wasn't just being watched, he was being assessed, judged, downgraded. He could feel the bank manager's eyes on his back, still smug from behind glass. One of the tellers shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to her keyboard. The security guard near the entrance tightened his stance and looked away. Across the room, an older woman clutched her purse a little closer. No one said anything, but everyone saw. Reggie exhaled through his nose. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the place with calm restraint, and walked out of the building. Outside, the street noise rushed in like a relief. Engines, horns, a siren a few blocks away. But Reggie didn't hear any of it. Not really. He stood beside the SUV for a moment, hand on the handle, and then he opened the driver's side door and slid in. His fingers hovered over the ignition. Instead of starting the car, he opened the glove compartment. There it was, folded and frayed at the corners. The letter he never threw away. The paper was worn, but the handwriting was still clear. A formal government seal at the top. Legal jargon, cold phrasing, insufficient evidence to reverse the asset seizure. Reggie stared at it for a moment, then folded it back carefully. His fingers brushed against something underneath. A business card, yellowing with age. Marcus Hale, attorney at law. He slid it back in and closed the compartment. From inside the bank, through the tall glass wall, Reggie could still see Chase Langford, laughing now, adjusting his tie, probably getting ready to text someone about the incident. Reggie didn't need to hear it to know what was being said. Words like mistake, driver, unqualified, angry black man. He'd lived with those words in the air for years, long enough to recognize them when no one said them out loud. His hand went to his collar instinctively. Beneath the crisp shirt was a small scar, just under the edge of his jaw, faint now, but still there. The only thing he'd kept from that winter, a scar left by paperwork, not a blade. A decade ago, when his properties were seized, his reputation destroyed, and his silence became his last defense. He'd learned then that speaking too loudly got you labeled angry, dangerous, so he'd shut his mouth and got behind the wheel. And now, today, in front of everyone, he'd been put in that same position again. Only this time, Shaq had been there, and he'd walked away. As the engine finally turned over and the SUV purred to life, Reggie adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a last glimpse of the bank behind him. His jaw clenched. He pulled away slowly. Inside the building, Chase straightened his tie again, this time in front of a small mirror tucked inside a cabinet. One of the junior associates, a red-haired man in a half-buttoned shirt, stepped in. "Langford," he said hesitantly, "you really think that was smart? Humiliating the guy in front of Marshawn?" Chase laughed, a short, hollow sound. "Please. Marshawn's a businessman. He's not going to burn his own connections over a driver." The associate looked unconvinced. Still, man had that look. What look? That look people get when they've had enough. Chase smirked. Everyone's had enough. Doesn't mean they do anything. He closed the mirror and walked out. Elsewhere, a few blocks down, Shaq sat at a bar counter in a quiet members-only lounge. He hadn't said a word since leaving the bank. The bartender, a man who knew better than to ask questions, simply placed a club soda with lime in front of him and walked away. Shaq stared at the glass. His mind wasn't on the drink. It was replaying the moment. Chase's tone, the glances from the staff, Reggie's stillness, the way he hadn't said anything, hadn't intervened, hadn't even made eye contact when Reggie looked back. He knew the cameras were watching. He knew any outburst, even justified, could be spun into something else. The cost of being Shaquille Marshawn wasn't measured in dollars. It was in perception. Power wasn't what you had. It was what people thought you could ruin. And yet, even with all that calculation, something felt off. It felt like losing. Quietly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of legal documents, the same ones Reggie had tried to submit. He looked at the signature line. His own name, neatly printed and inked. There was nothing wrong with them. So why had Chase acted like there was? A memory flickered. Not of the bank, but of a conversation from 2 years ago. Reggie had mentioned something about working in real estate before the crash. Nothing deep, just a passing comment. Shaq hadn't asked more. He never pressed Reggie. The man was solid, reliable, loyal to a fault. But now he wondered how much Reggie had left unsaid. Back in the SUV, Reggie pulled into a narrow alley behind a row of warehouses. He shut off the engine and sat for a moment. Then, from under the seat, he pulled out a small lockbox. Inside, more documents, news clippings, court transcripts. All of it old, all of it connected. The pieces of a story that no one had ever asked to hear, until maybe now. He flipped through one article. Local developer accused of fraud. Former military officer denies allegations. The photo was grainy, but it was him, younger, upright, still hopeful. A noise outside, a delivery truck passing, snapped him out of it. He closed the box and slid it back. If Shaq asked, he'd tell him. But only then. Later that night, Shaq stood on his balcony, looking out over the city. Lights blinked like signals from distant islands. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. He ignored it. His eyes drifted toward the street, toward a memory. He saw Reggie's face again. That quiet, composed hurt. And beneath it, something else. History. A weight. Shaq realized something he hadn't before. Reggie hadn't looked to him for help. He'd looked to see if Shaq still believed in him. And in that moment, by walking away, Shaq hadn't just stayed silent. He'd broken something. But silence has a sound. And in Shaq's world, that sound was beginning to echo. Inside a sleek bank built to intimidate, Big Shaq's driver is publicly humiliated, not by accident, but by design. A quiet man with a buried past, dismissed like he didn't matter. But what Big Shaq did next wasn't loud. It was calculated. What started as silence turned into a storm that shook the system. One moment of disrespect sparked a reckoning no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun leaned low over the Los Angeles skyline, casting an amber tint across the windshield of the black Navigator as it glided silently through light traffic. In the driver's seat, Reggie Harlow kept both hands at 10 and 2, fingers twitching ever so slightly to the rhythm of the jazz filtering through the sound system. His posture was perfect, eyes focused, shoulders relaxed, the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of driving the rich and powerful, and knowing how to read a man's silence. In the back seat, Shaquille Big Shaq Marchand leaned back with a half-lidded gaze, one wrist dangling over his knee, his tailored overcoat still crisp despite the warmth. He looked out the window like a man watching the world pass him by. Everyone in the city knew his name. NBA legend turned philanthropist, entrepreneur, public figure. But in this car there were no cameras, no press, just two men and an air of unsaid things. "Bank first?" Reggie asked, voice smooth like brushed suede. Shaq nodded without looking up. "Yeah, need to sort that wire nonsense with my charity account. Copy that Western Sovereign on Park." The Navigator slid off the main road and turned toward a more residential stretch. Shaq exhaled slowly and glanced toward the front. "You hear about that heat last week? That housing project story?" Reggie gave a faint nod. "They say the city's got empty units they won't open. Politics. Always is." Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. "Always somebody getting stepped on." Reggie gave a soft chuckle. "Long as you're not the one underneath, I guess." They shared a glance in the rearview. Familiar. Weighted. Not quite a joke. The kind of exchange only two men who've been through fire together can have. When they pulled up outside Western Sovereign Bank, the air shifted. Shaq gave a subtle side glance toward the signage, gold-trimmed, modernist, with just enough arrogance to fit the neighborhood. He didn't like banks, never had, not for personal reasons, but because he knew what they really were, places built to say no with a smile. Shaq moved slowly, his frame rising out of the SUV, like a skyscraper folding into shape. He waited by the entrance while Reggie went to park. The branch manager, Chase Langford, spotted him instantly from inside. Young, slick, with the kind of charisma that came in rehearsed grins and seasonal suits. He was already halfway to the door before Shaq entered. "Mr. Marchand, pleasure, Chase said, voice buttery as he extended his hand. "Can't believe I'm finally meeting you in person. You're a bit of a legend, you know." Shaq looked down at the handshake. He took it, firm and short. "Just here for some account stuff. Of course, I've already pulled the records. Should be quick." Reggie slipped in behind Shaq, just as the doors slid shut. He held a small leather folder with a signature page Shaq had signed earlier. As always, Reggie would handle the initial exchange. It was their rhythm. Shaq kept his presence quiet. People talked less when he stayed still. They approached the counter where a young teller, probably fresh out of college, motioned nervously to the side office. Chase gestured for them to follow. Inside the glass-walled office, things shifted. Reggie placed the documents on the table and said, "Mr. Marchand just needs a confirmation on the wire transfer. Funds for the Marchand Legacy Fund. All details are there." Chase skimmed the papers, and something in his expression twisted, barely perceptible. But it was there. He flipped a page, frowned, then leaned back. "This routing code's invalid," he said flatly. Reggie blinked once. "It's the same code we've used for 3 years." "Not anymore, apparently," Chase said, voice a little sharper now. "These documents are out of date. Who filled these out?" Reggie didn't answer at first. Shaq behind him shifted his weight slightly, eyes scanning the room. Still silent. "I did," Reggie finally said, calm but firm. "Well," Chase said, rising from his chair. "That's a problem. This isn't your account, sir. You can't be making these types of errors. You're just—" He paused. Reggie didn't flinch. "I'm going to need to speak to Mr. Marchand privately." Shaq didn't move. Reggie slowly turned his head back, as if to ask if he should leave. Shaq gave no response. Chase stepped out from behind his desk and motioned toward Reggie with a hint of arrogance. "Sir, you'll need to wait outside. This is a matter of account security." Reggie remained in place for a second too long. Not out of defiance, but because he was holding something back. Words he knew wouldn't help. Truths that would burn if spoken aloud. Then, slowly, he stepped back. "Of course," he said quietly, and turned. As he moved toward the door, Chase added with a chuckle. "Just loud enough to be heard. Next time bring someone who knows what they're doing." Reggie stopped. His jaw tensed, and so did Shaq's. The air went razor thin, but no one said anything. Reggie exited the office, and stood in the lobby, arms crossed, head low. People had noticed. A few customers murmured. A guard pretended not to look. A teller exchanged glances with another. Shaq remained inside. Chase tried to pick up the conversation, flipping to a different document. "Now, Mr. Marchand, I just want to make sure you know that mistakes like this can be—" Shaq raised a hand slowly. Not a command. Just a gesture. "Control. I'll come back," he said. Chase blinked. "So, I'll come back," Shaq repeated, voice level. "Not today." And then he stood up. Chase, momentarily thrown, fumbled for words. "But it's just a small error. I mean, we can fix it." Shaq turned without replying. In the lobby, Reggie stood motionless by the exit. Shaq walked past him, the same way he used to walk onto the court before a game. Silent, heavy, deliberate. Reggie followed, neither of them speaking a word. Once inside the SUV, Reggie sat still for a few seconds before starting the engine. "You all right?" Shaq asked. Reggie gave a short nod. "Happens. Ain't the first time someone thought I was stupid. Won't be the last." They drove in silence for a while. Traffic built up near 3rd Street. Horns. Pedestrians. A truck cut them off. Reggie's hands gripped the wheel tighter than before. But his face didn't move. "I didn't step in," Shaq said finally, voice almost too quiet to hear. Reggie looked at him through the mirror. "You didn't have to." They didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When they reached Shaq's downtown residence, a towering glass penthouse with a wide circular driveway, Reggie pulled up to the awning. As always. Shaq paused before getting out. "You taking the day tomorrow?" he asked. "Maybe." Shaq nodded slowly. "Call me if you don't." Reggie didn't answer. As Shaq walked into the building, his mind wasn't on the wire transfer, or Chase, or even the documents. It was on the way. Reggie had stood still, not defeated but dimmed, like a man who'd been there before, like someone who'd had everything taken from him once, and had decided not to fight anymore because no one had stood with him when it mattered. Shaq exhaled as the elevator doors closed around him. The lobby glass reflected back a towering man with silent fury in his eyes. Some lines, he knew, should never be crossed. But Chase Langford didn't know that. Yet, 3 days passed. No call, no text, no sign of Reggie. The SUV remained parked in its usual spot, untouched, a layer of city dust forming on its polished hood, like the quiet blanket of someone gone without saying goodbye. Shaq stood by the window of his penthouse, watching the curve of the driveway below, phone in hand, thumb hovering over Reggie's name in his favorites. The screen lit with the same result every time. Call failed, voicemail after 3 rings. The absence was louder than any argument could have been. Shaq had never realized how much of his world moved around Reggie's presence. The smooth, rhythmic reliability of his routines. His quiet judgment that kept things grounded. Shaq had built empires, won championships, stood in boardrooms with billionaires, but there was something about the steadiness of Reggie's presence that made it all seem human. Without him, the foundation felt off-kilter. He tried to shake it off, tried to keep moving. The Marchand Legacy Fund Gala was on the 3rd evening, a massive charity event held annually to raise funds for inner-city education programs. It was supposed to be Shaq's proudest night of the year. Cameras flashed as he entered, alone this time, climbing out of the passenger seat of a car he drove himself. The valet was too stunned to comment, but Shaq noticed the hesitation. Eyes followed him not because of his height, but because he wasn't in his usual rhythm. Inside, the ballroom buzzed with curated smiles and orchestrated laughter. White linen, polished crystal, suits tied around ambition. The host announced his arrival, and Shaq waved politely, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt like a guest in his own life. Near the bar, he pulled out his phone again. No response. When it came time for his speech, he walked to the podium, under a wash of soft lights. Faces turned. Phones rose. A sea of expectation. But Shaq, for the first time, felt the weight of silence in his throat. "I want to thank you all," he began, voice steady. "Not just for showing up, but for believing in something that's bigger than us. Opportunity, dignity, a second chance." He paused.
My driver, my friend, he's the one who told me once, you can't teach a man to rise if you don't first believe he's standing.
There was a ripple of confusion, a soft murmur. Shaq continued, gaze level. "You all know me. You know the brand, the speeches. But tonight I'm thinking about who stands behind people like me, the ones you don't see, the ones who don't get headlines. And how easy it is to forget they carry just as much weight as we do." He left the stage early. Applause came, soft and polite, but the room sensed something else had just happened. Something private had slipped into the public. Backstage, a young assistant approached him, eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Marchand, have you seen this?" She handed him a phone. A video was playing. Security footage from the bank. No audio, just silent clips strung together. Reggie placing papers on the desk. Chase Langford standing, gesturing, leaning in too close. Reggie stepping back. Then Shaq, walking away. The video was slickly edited. Zoom-ins. Slow motion. Text overlays. The headline in bold across the bottom. Driver dispute. Big Shaq's inner circle in question. The anchor's voice cut in. Multiple sources claim the man in the footage, identified as Reginald Harlow, has a questionable financial history, including past legal disputes and asset seizures tied to a 2012 fraud investigation. Shaq's jaw clenched. "Who leaked this?" The assistant shook her head. "No one's saying, but it's everywhere. Twitter, YouTube, even morning shows picked it up." He sat down slowly. The weight of it settled hard. Not just the betrayal of privacy, but the story being told. They weren't just dragging Reggie. They were rewriting him, shaping him into a narrative that fit their needs. The troubled, unstable background character, to a clean corporate celebrity, a disposable shadow. And worse, they were implying Shaq had distanced himself because he knew something. He stared at the screen. They'd chosen stills of Reggie, where his posture looked confrontational. Eyes downcast, misunderstood by design. They'd pulled old documents from court archives, used phrases like alleged misconduct, former military, pattern of behavior. It was surgical, professional smear work. And it was working. Shaq stood suddenly, heart thudding. His mind raced back to Reggie's scar, the letter in the glove box, the silence in his voice, things he'd never asked about because he thought it didn't matter. But now, the pieces were whispering to him. There was a story here, one Reggie had buried, and someone was trying to keep it buried. He called again. Still no answer. The next morning, news vans were outside his building. One reporter tried to shout a question from across the street. "Mr. Marchand, did your driver threaten a bank employee?" Shaq didn't answer. But inside, something had changed. He went back to the garage. The SUV was still there. He climbed in and sat behind the wheel. For a while he just sat, hands on the leather, engine off. Then he reached over and popped the glove compartment. The letter was still there. So was the card. He pulled both out and read the letter again, slowly this time. A wall of legal language, but one line stood out. Due to procedural discrepancies, the appeal has been denied and all related evidence sealed by order of court. Sealed evidence. He looked at the card again. Marcus Hale, attorney at law. He turned it over. Faint handwriting on the back. Tell no one until it's safe. Safe from what? The GPS still had the bank address in its memory. Reggie had never cleared it out. Just a small quiet detail. A habit. A rhythm. Shaq thought back to every moment. Reggie had quietly corrected the route, navigated traffic, anticipated detours. And now, he was the one lost. He typed the address into his own phone. It took him 3 attempts to get the right street. His thumb tapped too fast. His patience slipped. Then the voice came on. Turn left into... Shaq followed it, alone. Somewhere out there, Reggie was watching this unfold. Watching his name sink in the headlines. His dignity questioned. His loyalty framed like a liability. Shaq felt the sting of it deeper than expected. Not just because of the injustice, but because he'd stood by watching when the first stone had been thrown. Now it was time to do something he rarely did. Listen. Not to the noise, but to the silence Reggie had kept for years. And this time he wasn't going to walk away. The building stood on the edge of South Baldwin. Not quite run down. Not quite gentrified. A modest red brick structure with a rusted iron gate that wheezed on its hinges when Shaq pushed it open. Reggie had never invited him here. Not once in over a decade. He never needed to. Their bond had always existed on the move. In the car, between meetings, in the unspoken rhythm of arrival and departure. But now, with silence stretching into its 4th day, Shaq stood at the front door of apartment 2B, holding keys he never expected to use. The lock clicked open. The place smelled faintly of cedar, old leather, and coffee. Sparse furniture, clean counters, one chair facing a window that looked out at nothing in particular. The couch still held the impression of where someone had slept without sheets. A duffel bag half-packed sat near the corner. Shaq stepped inside slowly, quietly, like the walls might remember things better left undisturbed. A ceramic mug sat cold on the counter. A pair of cufflinks vintage lay beside it, next to a stack of unopened mail. Everything was in order. Except the trash bin. That's where Shaq saw it. The corner of a charred folder. Half-burned edges curling like the aftermath of a warning. Not a mistake. He reached down and carefully pulled it out. The heat had only reached a few pages, but what remained was intact. Inside were old legal documents. Yellowed, but legible. Property deeds from over a decade ago. Commercial units, residential plots, even a small community center in Long Beach. All under the name Reginald Harlow. Shaq blinked. Reggie had never once spoken about owning property, much less that much. Attached were photocopies of eviction notices, federal audit forms, and a court order with a name he didn't recognize. Langdon and Pierce Ferris Harlow. The words "case dismissed with prejudice" were stamped at the bottom. Tucked in the back, a note in Reggie's handwriting read, "They took everything from me once. I won't let them again." Shaq read it twice. The writing was calm, precise, but the words buzzed like a live wire. He sat on the arm of the couch, the file in his lap, his thoughts spiraling into places he'd never looked before. This wasn't just about humiliation at a bank. This wasn't about paperwork. This was history coming back. Unfinished, unresolved. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to his legal team. Not to a publicist. But to an old name he hadn't spoken to in 6 years. A voice answered on the second ring. Raspy, dry, no hello. "It's Shaq, Marshawn." A pause. "I figured the number looked expensive. What do you want, big man?" "Don't say tickets. I hate stadium crowds." Shaq didn't laugh. "I need a favor." "Off books." A longer pause now. "All right," came the reply. "Where are we digging?" Delaney Cord looked nothing like the private investigators you saw in movies. No trench coat, no fedora, no whiskey glass on a cluttered desk. She wore jeans, a sarcastic t-shirt that said "Trust me, I know a guy," and sneakers with ink-stained laces. Her office was a small second-floor loft above a vegan tattoo parlor, and the only decoration was a corkboard with overlapping photos, newspaper clippings, and sticky notes covered in shorthand that read like riddles. When Shaq walked in, he had to duck under a half-hung bike wheel she refused to move. "First off," she said, tossing a file onto the desk, "your guy isn't just a driver. He's a ghost with receipts." These deeds? She tapped the scanned copies Shaq had sent her. Real. Bought legally. Lost in a foreclosure avalanche that stinks worse than my neighbor's kombucha. You checked the foreclosure details. I didn't just check. I cross-referenced the case logs. Reggie was building low-income properties on land that became prime once the rezoning happened in 12. You know who filed the foreclosure claim? Who? Western Sovereign Holdings. Shaq narrowed his eyes. The bank, technically their property's subsidiary. But it's the same tree. You want to guess who was on the board of that sub at the time? Chase Langford. Bingo. She leaned back in her chair. Reggie tried to fight it, but the court used a forged signature on one of his loan renewals. The handwriting didn't even match. Still, the judge shut him down. No appeal. Case sealed. Someone wanted it buried. Bad. Shaq looked at the document again. The stamped seal. The clean dismissal. He never told me. Cord shrugged. Men like him don't. You ever meet a man who lost everything but still shows up on time? That's someone who doesn't believe the world owes him a damn thing. Shaq nodded slowly. What else can you find? Give me 2 days. I'll dig into the judge, the filings, Langford's old connections. But if this gets noisy, someone's going to notice. Keep it quiet. She tilted her head. Why you care so much? Shaq didn't answer immediately. He stood, looking out the window at the street below. People passed, texting, rushing, unaware. Then he said, because someone looked out for me when I didn't even know I needed it. I owe that back. Cord gave a half smile. Then let's find out who decided to erase him. The next day, Shaq returned to the apartment. This time, he brought gloves and a portable scanner. He searched through the rest of the room, careful not to disturb too much. In a side drawer, behind a stack of CDs, he found a single photograph. A young Reggie standing in front of a community center ribbon cutting, smiling next to a group of kids. The name on the banner above them read, Harlow Youth Resource Center. The same center that had disappeared from public records. Gone. Like it never existed. Shaq scanned it and placed it back. He sat down again, holding the image on his tablet, and wondered how many of the people at his galas, his fundraisers, had been part of the same system that allowed this kind of erasure. He remembered Reggie driving through East Compton in silence, nodding toward corners and buildings without comment, buildings Shaq had never asked about, because he never thought to. His phone buzzed. Cord's voice came fast. Found something. Go. That judge on Reggie's foreclosure case. He retired a year after the ruling. Quiet exit. Took a position at a private equity firm. Guess who chairs it? Shaq didn't breathe. Eleanor Sharp. Chairwoman of Western Sovereign's board. The same woman who signed off on Langford's internal promotion. She's the real puppet master. Shaq absorbed the name. It meant nothing to him yet, but he'd remember it. Reggie knew all this. Some. Not all. But enough to get scared. Enough to stay quiet. He probably thought if he pushed again, they'd bury him for good. Shaq felt the weight in his chest. This was no longer about a single act of humiliation. This was about someone who had been systemically dismantled. One property, one document, one courtroom at a time. Keep digging, he said, and find me a thread. Something legal we can pull without warning them. I'll find your thread, Cord replied. But be ready. Once it unravels, it won't stop. That night, Shaq sat at his kitchen table, the photo of Reggie and those kids displayed on the screen in front of him. He imagined the day it was taken, the hope, the pride, the purpose, and how it had all been crushed under paperwork, policy, and silence. He picked up the phone and called a number stored deep in his contacts. Not a lawyer, not a PR rep, but an old friend who once ran internal ethics reviews for a major financial watchdog group. When the voice answered, Shaq said just one thing. I've got something I need you to see, and I need it airtight. Then he opened a drawer and slid Reggie's burnt file inside. Some stories, he thought, don't stay buried. Not when someone's willing to dig. Delaney Cord's office had transformed. The once chaotic corkboard now displayed a brutal linear sequence. Photographs of deeds, court rulings, notarized contracts with barely legible signatures. At the center was a headshot of Chase Langford, thumbtacked in like the cheap villain of a political thriller. But the red thread webbing out from his face didn't make him look powerful. It made him look used. A proxy. He was a junior exec back then, Delaney said, spinning slowly in her chair. Had zero authority to approve any of these seizures. You need 3 signatures to initiate a strategic foreclosure on community-backed property. Shaq leaned over the desk, eyes scanning the papers, mind moving fast. Who else signed? That's the trick. Most of the forms only show one name, Langford's. Shaq frowned. That's not possible. No one man can greenlight those moves alone. Delaney smirked. Exactly. Someone erased the others. Digitally. This isn't sloppy fraud. This is engineered invisibility. She tapped the corner of a printed screenshot. Metadata logs from the bank's internal system. These files were altered 2 months after the original submission. Only someone high up could manipulate server-level timestamps and override access records. Shaq felt a pit grow in his stomach. So Langford gets to be the face of it. But someone else rewrote the history. Delaney nodded. He's the fall guy, groomed for it. Promoted just high enough to look like leadership, but still dumb enough to take the hit. She walked to the wall and clicked her remote. A projector whirred to life, displaying a spreadsheet of property losses across low-income neighborhoods from 2011. Dozens of names, but one pattern stood out. Every 5th foreclosure tied back to the Western Sovereign Development Fund, a shell company under the bank's real estate arm. Here's where it gets interesting, she said, highlighting 3 names on the list. These guys tried to sue. Each case was dismissed before it reached discovery. And then, Shaq leaned in. They disappeared? No, she said. They recanted, or settled. But they all shut up. Completely. She handed Shaq a sealed envelope. Inside were transcripts from internal whistleblower reports filed with the State Financial Integrity Bureau, all redacted except for key lines. One stuck with him. Pattern of targeted foreclosure on urban revitalization zones, deliberate undervaluation, manipulation of credit scores, direct pressure from upper leadership to clean the block. Shaq stood still for a long time, holding the papers like they weighed more than they should. They weren't just taking back properties. They were stripping out the roots. Delaney lit a fresh stick of cinnamon gum. Exactly. And they needed fall guys. Your friend Reggie? He wasn't humiliated over a mistake. He was being recontextualized, turned into a liability, in case he remembered too much. Shaq turned toward the board. They knew he was watching. They also knew he wouldn't speak. Men like him never do. Not unless someone gives them a reason. Shaq didn't say anything. But his eyes didn't move from the wall. From Reggie's name scrawled on a half-charred deed, surrounded by red ink, and silence. The next day, Shaq stood in the elevator of a sleek downtown building, 30 floors up in polished steel. He wasn't there for a meeting. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to feel something. Something unspoken. The name Western Sovereign was etched in silver across the wall. Receptionists smiled. Suits moved fast. He stood in the lobby for a few minutes, watching the flow of their world. The efficiency, the arrogance. He walked past a display of awards and industry recognitions, all framed under glass. He paused at one plaque near the corner. Community Reinvestment Champion 2013. The photo beneath it showed Eleanor Sharp, arms crossed, smiling without warmth. Langford just behind her to the right. Shaq stared at the photo. This was the puppet master Delaney mentioned. The quiet one. The one who never got her hands dirty. Later that night, Delaney called again. I got a hit on one of the whistleblowers. Guy named Thomas Wexley. He used to audit foreclosure pathways for compliance. Where's he now? Shaq asked. Off-grid. Utah. I reached out through a burner account. He'll talk, but not on record. Says his NDA is still active. Shaq tapped the steering wheel of the SUV. Reggie's SUV. He hadn't driven it much until now. Somehow it felt like the only space where the pieces made sense. Set it up, Shaq said, and record it anyway. You sure? They tried to erase the truth. Let's make a copy. Wexley's testimony came in broken audio. A quiet voice, distorted by fear, more than distance. I was assigned to Western Sovereign's redevelopment cases. All seemed clean, until I noticed the appraisals. Every minority-owned property was assessed 30–40% below comparable lots. Same size, same condition. And then, the Langford loop started showing up. Shaq leaned forward. The Langford loop? Delaney asked. Internal nickname. Wexley continued. It meant cycling a file through Langford's desk for the final kill switch. He had override power, but he only exercised it with a specific kind of property. Small lot developments in rezoned areas. Community-based funding. Stuff like Harlow's projects. Shaq's voice was low. So they set him up. Wexley's voice cracked. They turned his records against him, claimed he defaulted. But I saw the statements. Payments were on time. They moved the due date after the fact, and called it a breach. Delaney cursed under her breath. And when I flagged it, Wexley added, they buried the file. Next week I was offered a severance package, and a gag clause. Why didn't you fight? Because I have a daughter. Because they made sure I knew they could tank my credit, revoke licenses, make me unhireable. So I took the money, and the recording ended. The silence afterward was heavier than anything they'd heard. Shaq sat still for a moment, then said, that's enough. We've got the chain. Time to tighten it. Delaney cracked her knuckles. One problem. Langford's clean. Publicly. We can't drag him into a hearing without triggering his defense team. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Then we don't go at Langford first. We go after the floorboards under him. The strategy took shape fast. Delaney pulled 2 more old cases, low-level loan officers, who had signed off on sudden reclassifications of stable properties. Both were now working mid-level jobs in unrelated companies. They were small players, but scared ones. When she contacted one of them, a woman named Marlene Corin, she was visibly shaken, just hearing the words Western Sovereign. She agreed to meet at a public cafe in Pasadena. Shaq went with Delaney. Marlene arrived 15 minutes late, sunglasses too large for her face. She sat down, already whispering, I was told this would never come up again. We're not here to bury you, Shaq said, his voice calm but steady. We're here to expose who did the burying. She hesitated, then opened her purse and slid out a USB drive. This has copies of the original ledgers, before the overwrites. I kept them because I was afraid, not because I wanted to help. Delaney took the drive. Shaq leaned in. You're helping now. Marlene looked at him, eyes flicking up to his face, then away. They built the system like a maze, but everyone had to pull one lever, and we all convinced ourselves we weren't the machine, just part of it. He said nothing. She stood and left without finishing her tea. Delaney plugged the USB into her laptop as soon as they were back in the car. The ledgers lit up, lines and lines of adjusted figures, ghost entries, and metadata trails. Names Shaq didn't know, dates that matched Reggie's eviction. Silent evidence finally speaking. Can we use this? Shaq asked. Delaney grinned. Oh yeah, we don't just have corruption now. We have proof of fraud. We've got names, falsified documents, and a pattern of discrimination. And Langford? She turned the screen toward him. He signed the orders, but he didn't edit the code. You know who did? Shaq stared at the name. Eleanor Sharp. Delaney leaned back. Now we know whose ledger matters. Shaq closed the laptop. Then let's shake her world. Reggie looked at him. Because you were building your name while I was losing mine. Because if I dragged you into my story back then, they would have come for you too. You didn't think I could handle it? No, Reggie said. I didn't think I had the right to ask. Delaney let the silence settle for a beat, then broke it. You had the evidence. You had the timeline. Why go dark? Reggie walked to the table, lifted a folder, and handed it to Shaq. Inside were photocopies of internal bank memos, signed testimonies from 2 junior analysts, and a thumb drive taped to a page with a label, Full Archive, Corrupt Chain. He pointed to the label.
That was supposed to go to the feds.
Sent it 3 days before they revoked my license and froze my accounts. They fabricated a credit default. My phone got wiped. My lawyer got served. And then they pulled my VA pension. Quietly. Without a headline. Just gone. He rubbed the side of his face, where the scar faded into the beard. I knew if I kept pushing, I'd disappear. For real this time. So I waited. Shaq looked through the folder slowly. Every page made his stomach churn. There were signatures that didn't match, entries that changed dates midline, an approval signed under dead executive's name. You were going to blow it all open, he said quietly. Reggie met his gaze. Until I saw that bank floor, and realized they were still playing the same game. Delaney tilted her head. Then why not run? I almost did, packed the bag, burned the trail, but then I saw that video, the way they edited it, the way they made it look like I snapped, like I was unstable. That wasn't just about me. That was insurance. In case I ever came back, in case someone like him, he nodded to Shaq, ever decided I was worth believing. Shaq set the folder down. You think it's too late to fight? Reggie shook his head. I think the only way to win is not to swing first. Let them step forward. Let the truth speak. Delaney stood. We have enough to open an inquiry. But once we do, they'll know we're coming. You sure you're up for this? Reggie gave a tired smile. I've been waiting for this fight since the day they took my name off that deed. Shaq stepped forward, voice calm but solid. Then we don't blink, we take it public. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. Reggie looked at him, not as a boss, not even as a friend, but as an equal. You really believe people care about the truth? Shaq didn't hesitate. I believe they care when someone shows them it matters. They stood there a moment longer, the three of them in the tiny trailer, surrounded by the quiet hum of old wounds and new purpose. Outside, the sun dipped lower against the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked ground. Reggie walked to the corner and pulled out a locked case. Inside was a copy of every document, every drive, every duplicate he had buried over the years. He handed it to Delaney. If I go down, that's the parachute. She took it. You're not going down. Shaq looked at the photo on the wall again, the young version of Reggie, hopeful, ambitious, standing on land he believed he could shape. That man had been almost erased. But the fire in Reggie's eyes now said otherwise. As they stepped outside, the wind picked up for the first time all day. Reggie locked the trailer and looked toward the horizon. What happens when we open it all up? Shaq said. We don't just prove what they did. We make sure it never happens again. Reggie nodded, the weight in his chest easing just enough to breathe deeper. Then, let's give them something to remember. And with that, the silence that had kept them apart finally ended. Not with a shout, not with applause, but with an agreement made in quiet defiance. The press didn't catch wind of it at first. There was no speech, no tweet, no press release. Just a quiet financial filing, recorded in the morning data dump. Shaquille Marchand had purchased a sizable stake in TerraVast Holdings, the parent company that owned Western Sovereign Bank. A minor move in appearance, but it granted him enough voting power to file a Class B shareholder suit against the executive board for misappropriation, non-disclosure, and ethics violations. Delaney had warned him the spotlight would come fast, but she underestimated just how fast. By noon, it wasn't just finance blogs covering it. CNN ran the headline, NBA legend takes on big banking empire in secret corruption case. The clip showed Shaq outside his foundation's headquarters, flanked by Delaney and two lawyers. He wore no tie, no script, just a slate gray suit, and the look of a man who'd already made up his mind. This isn't personal, he said, voice steady into the microphones. It's about accountability. It's about a system that punishes people for being small and protects people for being silent. We're done being silent. He walked away without taking questions. Langford wasn't silent for long. That same evening, a carefully rehearsed interview aired on a business talk show, hosted by a former Wall Street strategist. Langford sat poised, hair slicked, eyes polished. His tone was condescendingly measured. I've always respected Mr. Marchand, he said, but I fear he's been misled by individuals with an agenda. This narrative of fraud is simply unfounded. The documents they've presented have been selectively edited. Anyone who works in finance knows that mistakes happen. But this is something else. This is a targeted smear. He smirked, barely. The host nodded along. You're saying Marchand's being used. I'm saying he's being emotional. And it's costing good people their reputations. Delaney watched the segment from her laptop in the back room of her office, chewing her gum with more intensity than usual. Shaq sat beside her, jaw set. Man thinks he's playing poker, she muttered, but he doesn't realize the table's about to collapse. Shaq didn't answer. His attention had shifted to something else, a flash of a name in the ticker below the segment. Eleanor Sharp, chairwoman of TerraVast Holdings, declines to comment. There she was, the one who hadn't spoken, the one who hadn't needed to, until now. The next day, Sharp appeared on a conference call with the rest of the board. The room she sat in was white marble and steel, devoid of warmth. She wore a navy suit, her silver hair tightly swept back, her posture as if carved from the same chair she sat in. I want this lawsuit neutralized within the quarter, she said coldly. Langford's media tour bought us time, but not trust. Our share price is twitching. If it drops 3 more points, we open ourselves to outside acquisition. One of the younger execs leaned in nervously. We've begun a review of the accusations. Our internal counsel thinks we can spin the Reggie Harlow case as a rogue compliance error. Sharp's eyes flicked to him like a scalpel. You don't spin corruption, you bury it. Am I clear? He swallowed. Crystal. Another board member asked. And Marshawn? We isolate him, Sharp said. Discredit his evidence. We leak inconsistencies. Stir conflict. Find a former associate willing to paint him as volatile. She paused. Or naive. Back at the Marshawn Legacy offices, the tone was shifting. What started as a small private mission had become a national conversation. Journalists circled like drones. Influencers debated the ethics of banks on TikTok, and legal analysts dissected shareholder rights on primetime television. But for Shaq it wasn't noise. It was pressure. Reggie had stayed quiet since returning from the trailer, working out of Delaney's spare office, reviewing files, organizing timelines. He hadn't spoken on camera. Not once. His re-emergence was deliberate, one step at a time. We've got a shot, Delaney said one morning, flipping her laptop toward Shaq. SEC just opened a preliminary inquiry. You kicked the door in. Shaq barely blinked. Now we hold it open. But the attacks came faster than expected. A sudden article appeared online, heavily circulated, claiming Shaq's investments in education charities were mismanaged due to inexperienced advisors. Another anonymous source claimed Reggie had once been removed from a veteran housing board for threatening behavior. There were no names, no quotes, just shadow. Delaney scrolled through it with a grimace. They're trying to drown us in ink. Shaq leaned back. Let them try. Truth can't drown if we keep it moving. Then came the first subpoena, from Teravast's legal team, accusing Delaney of unauthorized extraction of proprietary bank documents. A shot across the bow, a warning. Classic suppression tactic, she said, filing it into her desk drawer. They want to force us to react. Shaq stood up. Then we don't. We escalate. The next move was strategic, a live-streamed roundtable moderated by a respected civil rights journalist. Shaq didn't make it about Reggie. He made it about every foreclosure victim the bank had erased. They aired pre-recorded interviews with whistleblowers, former bank employees, and one elderly couple who'd lost their home in 2014 after a forged signature cost them their refinance. Shaq ended the session with a line that hit harder than any press statement. This isn't just business. It's memory. It's where people raised their kids. It's where they healed. And these institutions treated those places like numbers they could crush and hide. By morning, the video had 10 million views. A new headline replaced the smear campaign. Truth in the Ledger. Inside the scandal at Western Sovereign. Sharp watched the clip from her penthouse office. Expression unreadable. She didn't flinch, but her assistant noticed she didn't touch her coffee for the first time in 20 years. Get me the litigation team, she said quietly. And bring Langford in. Now. The boardroom felt colder than usual when Langford arrived. His tie was perfect. His skin slightly clammy. Sharp turned toward him slowly. You said you had it under control. I didn't anticipate. You didn't think, she snapped, her voice never rising above a whisper, but sharper than a scream. You gave him something to point at. You made us visible. Fix it. Langford opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked afraid. I think, he tried again. I think we may need to offer a settlement. Something quiet. Before depositions start. Sharp's eyes turned to ice. You don't offer wolves scraps. You set the forest on fire and starve them out. Langford nodded, swallowing his panic. Then we leak something bigger. Something that resets the narrative. She turned to her advisor. Find the file we buried. The one from the mayor's development fund. We'll use it to pivot. Pivot to what? He asked. Sharp's expression didn't change. To a distraction. That evening, Delaney walked into Shaq's office with a look that signaled trouble. They just fired their first missile, she said, tossing a new article onto the desk. It claimed that a former city official tied to the Marshawn Legacy Fund had accepted bribes from developers, and that the fund's name appeared in the recipient's ledger. It's false, Delaney said, but they'll bleed us with shadows if we let them. Shaq stared at the page. Calm. Let them. They just told the world we hit a nerve. Delaney smirked. You're enjoying this. I'm not, he said. But I've played in games where the scoreboard was stacked against us. This isn't new. It just finally matters. She leaned forward. Sharp's going to come at you directly next. Then she'll learn the same thing. Langford's learning. He said. What's that? That I don't play chess. I flip the table if the board's crooked. Outside, cameras still waited. Lights blinked. The noise grew. But inside the strategy room, Shaq, Delaney, and Reggie circled a table filled with timelines, flowcharts, sworn statements, and legal filings. They weren't playing defense anymore. They were preparing for the next move, the one that would make Eleanor Sharp leave her tower and show her face. And when she did, it wouldn't be in silence. It would be in court. His voice stayed even. No break, no anger. I lost everything. My credit, my pension access, my name. They turned me into a risk. All because I was one of the first to question where the money was going. A screen lit behind him. A line of figures blinked into view. Foreclosure data, racial demographic patterns. Internal bank emails redacted, except for phrases, sweep the zone, risk cluster containment strategy. Then Delaney stepped up. Her tone was clipped. Surgical. We conducted a private investigation over 6 months. We followed data trails, subpoenaed metadata logs, extracted deleted records from back-end servers. What we found was a systemic campaign, not just negligence, not isolated fraud, but an orchestrated effort to weaponize real estate policy against low-income developers and minority-owned assets. Another slide appeared, a spreadsheet with altered property values. One column showed actual appraisals, the other the bank's submitted versions. Delaney pointed. They didn't just misreport. They manufactured value drops to justify seizures, and it wasn't done by mistake. It was executed by a digital clearance team under the direct authority of one Chase Langford, a junior executive promoted precisely at the time these modifications began. The name hit the room like a wire pulled tight. A voice called out from the press seats. Is Langford here today? Chairwoman Rawls nodded to her right. Langford sat at a separate table. His suit was darker than usual. His jaw tense. He leaned forward, hands folded. I categorically deny these allegations, he said into the mic. I executed bank policy under compliance guidelines. The documents they're referencing are out of context. Mr. Marchand is being used. Ms. Cord is under investigation for data theft. And Mr. Harlow, he turned his head, just slightly, has a history of professional misconduct. A low murmur rippled through the room. Shaq didn't flinch. Delaney didn't blink. Reggie just stared. Langford continued. This is a coordinated character assault. They've manipulated media. Their evidence is speculative. There's no internal confirmation of these allegations. He leaned back. The smugness was thinner now, a layer cracking under the pressure. That's when it happened. A clerk walked quickly to the committee chair and handed her a sealed envelope. Her eyes narrowed as she read the attached note. We've just received a sworn statement, she announced, from a new witness. This person was contacted anonymously last week. From the back of the room, a man in his 50s stepped forward. Trim, nervously clutching a briefcase. He identified himself as Nolan Creed, a former senior auditor for Western Sovereign's Oversight Division. He was not on the original witness list. Creed raised his hand, took the oath, and sat. I was responsible for internal ethics reviews at Western Sovereign from 2011 to 2015, he began, voice shaking. During that time, I flagged over 27 anomalies in property seizures, each one tied to regional branches operating under expedited review authority. He pulled out a folder. Inside were original reports, signed logs, and email threads between Langford internal legal teams, and finally, Eleanor Sharp. The room stiffened. Creed continued. I was told to shut down the review. My job was threatened. But I archived the evidence. Quietly. I couldn't forget what I saw. When I saw Mr. Marchand speak, I knew I couldn't stay hidden anymore. The screens behind him lit up. Email excerpts directly connecting Langford to Eleanor Sharp. Keep Langford isolated. He'll sign what we give him. Audit flagged again. Suppress. Harlow is too close. Discredit him. Quietly. The last line blinked across the screen in stark black text. Gasps echoed. Phones began to buzz. Typing filled the press rows like rainfall. Langford's face turned gray. Shaq watched him. Didn't move. Didn't blink. Because sometimes silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was power. Chairwoman Rawls raised a hand. We will take a 30-minute recess to review this submission. As the committee rose, Langford's attorney whispered furiously into his ear. Security stepped forward, not aggressively, but with formality. It was the beginning of the end. Reggie exhaled for the first time in what felt like a year. Delaney slid the folder of Nolan Creed's originals into a secure bag. Shaq just sat there, eyes locked on the room, taking it all in. Justice hadn't landed yet. But it was finally airborne. The headlines came fast and died faster. Langford resigns amid escalating corruption probe. Sharp steps down from Teravas board following oversight committee findings. Western Sovereign fined $118 million in property fraud settlement. Televised panels debated the fallout for a week. Podcasts milked soundbites. Experts weighed in on structural failures, regulatory gaps, and the cultural reckoning in financial ethics. And then, just like always, the world moved on. But inside the silence that followed, something else took root. Something quieter, deeper. For Reggie Harlow, vindication came in the form of a 3-paragraph statement, published on page 7 of a national paper. The sentence that mattered was buried in the second paragraph. Federal auditors concluded that Mr. Harlow's properties were unlawfully seized due to falsified internal documentation, and all charges levied against him in the 2012 investigation have been retroactively dismissed. He read it once, folded the paper, and slid it into a drawer. A month later, the government returned 2 of his old parcels. One residential duplex in Long Beach, and the shell of the original Harlow Youth Resource Center. Its walls still tagged with graffiti, windows long boarded up. They offered financial compensation for the rest. He accepted only a portion. The rest, he asked them to redirect into arts education grants for underserved neighborhoods. He didn't want back what was taken. He wanted to give something no one could steal. It was Shaq's idea, or at least the spark of it. They were sitting on a bench one night, outside a diner in Inglewood. Shaq had just come from a foundation board meeting, and Reggie had just walked 2 miles from a community youth jam session, where kids with second-hand trumpets and off-key guitars had been making noise that somehow still sounded like hope. "You thinking of starting something again?" Shaq asked. Reggie didn't answer right away. He looked out at the street, where an old man was sweeping up leaves in front of a barber shop with half its letters burnt out. "I'm not who I was back then," he said. "That man wanted to build institutions, foundations, stuff that lasted on paper. But now? Reggie smiled faintly. "Now I think I just want to teach kids how to hold a beat, how to feel something when the world tells them not to." Shaq nodded slowly. "You build a rhythm that sticks. It lasts longer than a deed." Reggie glanced sideways. "You funding my rhythm now?" Shaq stood. "I'm just covering the opening act. The rest's on you." 2 months later, the Harlow School for Music and Movement opened in a renovated rec center on 8th and Jordan. No ribbon cutting, no press release, just a line of kids on a Monday afternoon, some of them still in oversized uniforms, some with headphones clutched like lifelines. Inside, the walls were painted bright, and a mural of sound waves stretched across the back of the main room. Reggie ran it himself. No staff yet. Just volunteers. A local jazz musician helped with drums. A retired school counselor came Tuesdays to supervise studio sessions. They had 3 violins and 2 working keyboards. It was enough. Shaq visited only once. Late at night, long after the kids had gone home. He walked the hallway quietly, smiling at the scuffed floors. The wall hooks filled with mismatched backpacks. He found Reggie in the back room, tuning an old guitar with a missing string. "You ever gonna name the mural?" Shaq asked, pointing his chin toward the colorful sound waves. Reggie grinned. "Thought about calling it Balance. Every note needs it." Shaq nodded. "Fitting." He didn't stay long, just long enough to leave an envelope on the desk. Another donation, unsigned. Reggie didn't open it until the next morning. Inside was a single page with 1 sentence written in Shaq's blocky handwriting. "Some fights echo longer than applause." The media eventually stopped calling. Even Delaney turned down interview requests. She went back to private investigations, but took on more pro bono cases now. "I made enough money off rich people's messes," she told Reggie once, over coffee. "Now I want to clean up something real." As for Shaq, he never addressed the scandal again publicly. He didn't need to. His silence had said enough. Once weaponized against him, now turned into a signal of strategy, of principle. The shareholder lawsuit reached settlement quietly. He relinquished his board votes after 1 term. "They're not my rooms to clean," he told Delaney. "I just needed the lights turned on long enough to see who was still standing." And Reggie, he stood, not in front of cameras or behind podiums, but in classrooms, on broken stages, in the pause between 2 notes, teaching kids that their voice mattered even when it cracked. That dignity didn't need headlines. It needed roots. One Friday, a girl named Naya brought in a battered saxophone she found in her uncle's garage. It barely played. But Reggie sat with her for 2 hours, adjusting keys, taping leaks, letting her find her breath. When she finally managed to hit a clean note, her smile cracked open the whole room. That night, Reggie sat alone, listening to old recordings on a portable speaker, not of testimony or hearings, but of the first day his original center opened, all those years ago. Kids laughing, drums echoing, his voice saying, "We're not just here to learn, we're here to remember we matter." He paused the tape, looked out the window. The city was quieter now, not fixed, but changed. And somewhere beyond the noise, a rhythm continued. Not because of justice handed down, but because of dignity reclaimed, because two men stood still when it counted, and never stopped listening. The auditorium wasn't packed, but it was full. Folded chairs lined the gymnasium of a local community center that smelled faintly of floor polish and ambition. On stage, banners for the National Youth Leadership Forum hung with civic earnestness, students in branded lanyards, and hopeful eyes scribbled notes, whispered questions, checked their phones. At the center, under a soft wash of lights, Shaquille Marchand sat in a simple chair. No podium, no fanfare, just him. Behind him, a screen displayed slides from earlier speakers, policymakers, educators, youth advocates. Now it was Q&A time. A young man in the second row stood, thin frame, denim jacket, nerves in his throat. "Mr. Marchand," he said, voice barely above the mic's threshold, "you've done a lot, played pro, ran businesses, built foundations, changed laws even. But if you had to pick just one moment, one thing that was the most powerful thing you've ever done, what would it be?" The room quieted. Shaq looked at the kid for a moment, then let his eyes drift across the audience. Rows of students, interns, mentors, all leaning forward. He didn't answer right away. He exhaled, smiled gently, then said, "I listened." A beat of silence. Then a few heads turned, puzzled. He leaned in, resting his forearms on his knees. Not when it was easy, not when it was convenient, but when it would have been easier to speak, or to yell, or walk away. The screen behind him flickered. A technician in the corner cued a series of images. Shaq shaking hands with city leaders, speaking at press events, testifying in front of committees. But that wasn't the story he told. "I had a friend," he continued, "a man who drove me for almost 13 years. Knew every shortcut in the city. Knew how I liked my coffee. When to speak. When to stay quiet. Most days I didn't notice how much space he held up around me." A soft murmur rippled through a few rows, those who knew the name. Shaq went on. "Then one day, I watched him get humiliated. In public. By a man with a nameplate. And a smirk. And I didn't say anything. I walked away." The audience sat still now, not just in attention, but in awareness. "I didn't speak, because I thought silence would protect him. And maybe part of me didn't want to complicate my own comfort. But that silence, it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Because it made me start listening. To what had happened. To what was still happening. To what I'd ignored. All around me." The lights dimmed slightly, as the screen behind him changed again. Now playing a subtle montage of footage. Reggie walking out of the bank, his posture tight but contained. Reggie in court, quiet but clear. Reggie standing behind Shaq as the cameras flashed, always a step out of the spotlight. I listened to the people who had been erased in paperwork, flattened into statistics. The ones who didn't get headlines. The ones who lost everything and still showed up. A girl in the front row wiped her eye. A boy near the aisle sat up straighter. And then I realized being loud wasn't what changed the room. Knowing when not to speak, and when to amplify someone else's voice instead, that was the most powerful thing I'd ever done. The audience clapped. Not thunderous, not performative, but full. He didn't wait for it to rise. He simply nodded and added, "Sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's belief." In the back row, wearing a plain blue hoodie and a half smile, Reggie Harlow watched. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He didn't need a spotlight. He just wanted to see it happen. The moment Shaq closed the loop. Not with revenge, not with noise, but with truth. As the session ended, and the crowd began to file out, Shaq stayed on stage, answered a few more quiet questions, signed notebooks, posed for 2 photos. Nothing extravagant. Eventually, he stepped down and slipped toward the side exit, moving through a short hallway lined with vending machines and bulletin boards. Reggie was there, leaning against the wall like he'd been standing in that same spot for years. Shaq stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. No words. Then, "You get all that?" Shaq asked, gesturing back toward the stage. Reggie shrugged. "Most of it." "You'd have said it better," Reggie chuckled. "Nah. I'd have just played a slow song and left the rest to the chords." They walked out together. Outside, the street was quiet. Late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, catching the tops of parked cars and flickering across the sidewalk. Reggie pulled a small folded paper from his jacket, the page from the newspaper that cleared his name. He handed it to Shaq. "You ever want to frame this?" Shaq looked down at it.
Then back at Reggie.
"Nah," he said. "Already framed the real story." Reggie smiled. "And what's that?" Shaq turned to him. "That we kept showing up, even when no one clapped." They crossed the street together. No cameras. No applause. Just two men, side by side, knowing something most people didn't. That real power didn't come from being loud. It came from knowing when to listen and who to listen to. This wasn't just about a driver. It was about every quiet injustice you've ever walked past. Dig beneath the headlines. You'll find a system that counts on our silence. So ask yourself, who's driving the story? And who's being driven out of it? Stick around, not just to watch, but to remember.